Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Postkahanism podcast. I'm here with Rick Spence, who's a professor emeritus of history at the University of Idaho. His work includes Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, and a bunch of other fascinating books, which you should all definitely go and buy on Amazon and check them out. He was recently on Lex Friedman's podcast, which you guys should also go check out. And so welcome back to the podcast, Rick.
Thanks for having me back on. It's my pleasure.
It's pleasure's all mine. So I wanted to, I have a bunch of topics that I wanted to kind of discuss with you and see where it goes. A lot of stuff has happened since our last conversation last year, right? Trump got elected, and we're seeing some stuff that really made me think of the Soviet Union in some unexpected ways. So I wanted to ask you, Trump is trying to reindustrialize the U.S. with tariffs and so on, apparently. And I was thinking, are there examples of a country reindustrializing itself? And of course, I thought of the USSR in the 1920s, where they had this big industrial plant, but all the people that knew how to run it were either dead or had run off or whatever, and then they had to try to rebuild. The U.S. had something maybe a little bit similar in the sense that manufacturing was sort of driven out of the U.S. in some ways over the last several decades. Do you think that that's a valid parallel? What are your thoughts on this process?
Well, I'm not sure the parallel with the early 20th century Russia works too well. I mean, Russia had started industrializing late, really beginning with Vita's reforms in the 1890s. You could really say around 1890 is when things got going. And starting way behind other European countries like Germany or Britain, they've made a lot of progress up until the First World War. And that came along and screwed up everything. That shut down much of, and then the resulting Civil War, the Revolution, various Soviet policies. So what you had was a relatively, even up to 1917, while Russia had an industrial base, it was still relatively small. It was not commensurate to what the country could eventually become. So there was something that had to be kind of physically rebuilt. And then what you had were the policies. And I'm no great fan of Joseph Stalin. Don't try to interpret that in some other way. But one of the things that was accomplished, particularly during the 1930s, with all of their various shortcomings, was that Russia, by the Second World War, had become a major industrial power. That is, it was simply building upon. I'm not even sure it had anything specifically to do with the miracles of communist policy or Stalinist policy. It had to do with the fact that Russia had a huge amount of potential, and that potential was finally being exploited in some kind of systematically and relatively effective way. The U.S., on the other hand, was by the early 20th century, was a pretty fully industrialized country. Making stuff was what we did. And there was beginning, I'd say most noticeably in the 1960s, was this gradual process of deindustrialization, or kind of offshoring. The best example I could give you that is the auto industry. So one of the things that the U.S. industrial base cut its teeth on in the early 20th century was manufacturing trucks and automobiles. Okay, this is the country of Henry Ford. And it's not that they weren't being produced elsewhere, but the U.S. simply began to produce motor vehicles on a much greater scale than anyone else. And Ford is but one example of that, the kind of the mass production. You could see that again in the ability during World War II of the U.S. economy to retool for war purposes, and again, just produce huge amounts of motor vehicles. We're very good at that. And that continued on into the post-war period where Americans certainly had more money and almost everyone could afford a car, even a used car if you couldn't afford a new one. There was a huge proliferation in automobiles. And, up until, and I was a kid in that period, so I can remember this. And, I can remember, say, probably as a relatively small child in the late 1950s, sitting on a porch at some relative's house, and one of the things that was a kind of game was to try to identify the different cars that came by. This was a sort of test that kids would have, and there were a lot more varieties of cars then, so it was a way of sort of picking them out. Almost never, let's say, in 1959, would you see a foreign car. Every car you saw was a domestically produced design. If it wasn't a Ford, it wasn't a Chevy, there were even Hudsons, there were Studebakers, there are all these brands that don't exist anymore. And every now and then, the only kind of foreign cars that existed were occasionally sports cars. Somebody would have a Triumph or an Austin Healey. Those are fairly exotic. Usually owned by somebody who wanted to show off in some way. And then the other things you'd notice were the Volkswagen Beetles. That was the most that was really the only kind of foreign car that you saw for a while. And they were cheap and some people drove them, but they weren't hugely popular other than the fact that they were inexpensive. Then in the course of the 1960s and into the early 1970s, there was the invasion of cheap Japanese cars, what were then called Datsuns and Toyotas and Hondas, and more of them came in. And there was also a huge increase in the number of Volkswagens and all of their different types, and more foreign cars began to come in. And the thing about it was that these cars were relatively, they were cheap. That was their the big advantage. They were inexpensive. They were fairly reliable. And as time went on, American cars became less reliable. People began to complain about Fords and Chevys and the rest of it. Problems with the engines. There was always an effort by Detroit to try to constantly redesign what it was doing. But you had other things going on. You had there'd always been a huge amount of labor issues in the auto industry. So the United Auto Workers was one of the more powerful unions. There were periodic strikes where they wanted more wages and benefits. And, auto manufacturers, being the good capitalists that they were, decided that one of the best ways to cut back on expenses was to cut back on labor. And that was to robotize as much of the process as possible. So there were fewer and fewer manufacturing jobs. And this was an American decision. This wasn't something that was forced upon them. It was essentially the idea to eliminate high-priced American unionized labor jobs by offshoring the production as much as possible to other countries, of having more and more parts made there and just having them assembled here, and also of the whole process of automation of the process as well. But there was also the perception that the quality of American cars declined, and so more and more Americans were willing to buy foreign cars, until you have a situation today in which overwhelmingly foreign cars dominate the market. That's generally what people will think of buying. And so it was something that was willingly done, not so much by the American populace or by the American consumers, although the consumers made choices. The consumers made choices to buy foreign cars as opposed to domestically produced cars, because those cars were perceived to be a better value. And frankly, in most cases, they were. They were cheaper and they were more reliable. And when you put that choice in front of people, that's what they'll go for. But the process was also, you could look at it also, it's like the steel production. The basis of auto manufacturing, as so much else, was based really upon steel production. And the U.S. steel industry, you could import steel cheaper from South Korea. So why indeed produce it here? So The U.S. in many ways willingly deindustrialized, or it got rid of much of the heavy industry. Everything, the economy and employment turned towards the service industry, which, as one person described it, is ultimately everybody selling everybody else pizza. That's what they were going to do. No one wanted those kinds of jobs. It was something else. I don't know anybody who wanted to go to work in a factory. And yet that's what, those were the type of jobs that a generation or so before people would have wanted, because it was dependable employment, generally paid fairly well. But I say, beginning with people of my generation, the insidious baby boomers, the people who were born after World War II and through the 50s and early 60s, none of us pretty much wanted that. We wanted to work in offices. We wanted to have something, we wanted to have sort of higher status in some respects. And so the jobs essentially in industry disappeared. The industry itself disappeared, much of the manufacturing. And then you wake up one morning and you find out that everything on the shelves in Walmart is made in China. And that actually was, but it wasn't something you were even aware of until it was suddenly there. That there's virtually no sort of, that finding something actually made in the U.S. was unusual. I did that once, just as a kind of, I suppose, as a sort of game or something else. I was going to point out to my wife, I said, okay, we're in a Walmart. Let's go around and see how many products that we can find are actually made in the U.S. And, there were some, but certainly they were the significant minority of what was there. Overwhelmingly, things were made overseas. Clothing is made overseas. The clothes you wear, everything else is made in El Salvador. It's made in Pakistan, elsewhere. And I'm not begrudging any of those workers in those countries their livings, but nevertheless, it's a whole change from a United States in which, let's say, certainly up to the period immediately after the Second World War, almost everything that people consumed was domestically produced, to a country in which almost everything people consume is no longer domestically produced.
I guess.
So is that progress or is that degeneration? Take your pick. I don't know.
Well, sorry, I'm getting some feedback. I think maybe the speakers are a little close or whatever. So, well, look, it's kind of a question, because the fact that the U.S. had all those people that knew how to make cars meant that they were able to spin off and make a lot of other stuff as well, for the war effort and not for the war effort. And conversely, when you have a generation that grows up and making stuff is something that happens overseas, that knowledge base is lost. You have a population which is no longer capable of making stuff because they don't have the engineering know-how, they don't have the machine operation know-how, they don't understand the processes, and so on and so forth. So you can say that in Russia it was a similar situation in a way after the war. Much of the skilled labor, of course, they weren't as industrialized as Germany, for instance, was. Or England, but they still had a decent amount of industry. One of the first heavy bombers, for instance, was Russian. They built it in 1916. All those people, well, many of those people either died during the Civil War and the Revolution, Civil War, or they emigrated, and so they had this issue in the 1930s. I'm sure you've read Darkness at Noon. Kessler illustrated this by having his main, I guess, villain saying, what was the famous thing he said? He said, like, until I was 20, I'd never seen a watch, which might, it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but most of the population was illiterate. Many of them were not very numerate. They were peasants. They were not used to coming in and doing precision work and working by the clock, day in, day out. And a lot of the evils of the 1930s was this centralized system trying to take this mass of people, force them into the cities, force them into factories, make them work to some kind of standard, right? Make them show up on time. Draconian penalties for not showing up on time. Draconian expropriations of food from the countryside to force people into kind of internal refugee status so they can be used as a labor force. America obviously doesn't have the same problem, right? But it's got a little bit of a parallel problem, it seems like to me. Like that's kind of the big question. Trump is trying to say, okay, well, let's use tariffs to make people make stuff here again. The question is, you have a population which, for the last 20 years, 30 years, hasn't made anything, or many of them haven't made anything. Can they adapt?
Are tariffs going to bring back American industry? Frankly, I don't see how. And I think you pointed out one of the main reasons for that is that you don't have a huge amount of, well, you got a lot of people who are unemployed or underemployed. Something else which has become much more obvious in this country, particularly in the last decade, but it's been growing for some time, is just the amount of homelessness. Essentially, I mean, that's always existed to some. You've always had it's always been a kind of long tradition, U.S. of hobos. They have different names: hobos, bums, tramps, migrant laborers who move back and forth. There's always been this underclass who move around. Often they would work in agriculture in some cases, but in some cases their goal was to hop trains and not work at all. But that's, you didn't have, again, I can never remember growing up or elsewhere of seeing what are now called homeless encampments, which are just large areas of open space, in some case public space. Sometimes there's sidewalks where people just have, they live in tents, or they live in cardboard boxes, or they actually begin to build. Some of them are very ingenious. I mean, these people know how to build things, but they don't have any homes, and many reasons. And there are a number of reasons for that. A fair number of them have mental illnesses. One of the things that was done generally across this country, certainly in my home state of California, beginning in the 60s and 70s, was they simply closed down the state-run mental hospitals and just put people, they had a new set of drugs. And the whole idea was that instead of institutionalizing people, we'll just put them out on the street and give them this regular supply of drugs, which will control their mania to the point, or whatever their problems are, that they can barely function. And no, it generally didn't do that. The drugs allowed them to wander around streets and stand on corners and yell at people, more or less harmlessly. But that sort of began that way. And then it is steadily increased until you have just the growth within cities themselves of vast, sprawling shanty towns. I mean, third world type of things. Lots of old motor homes that are brought in and just parked, and people live in them. And there's no real response to that. No public officials know what to do with it. And it simply proliferates, and without trying to point fingers as to who's to blame for that and what's gone wrong, it is a symptom of some kind of social decay.
This is something that I want to get a little bit into further in the conversation, the social decay. So it's also interesting. There's another parallel there in Russia in the 1920s. You had armies of, well, not armies, legions of what was called besprizorniki, which is to say kids who were in their, in their teens generally, maybe a little bit preteens, who were not in any sort of educational system. They were more or less homeless. They lived by begging and committing crimes, and there were many of them. I mean, this was a result of the Civil War. And one of the big pushes was to somehow deferalize these guys and start, making them work and use them as a labor resource instead of having them be this kind of legion of locusts destroying stuff around them. It does seem to me like there's parallels. I don't know that the U.S. doesn't really have central planning. I don't know that any of this stuff could be solved without central planning. I don't know that it could be solved with central planning. If there's a reversal in the cards for this trend, or if it's just irreversible social decay. There's something, I want to come back to this though. There's something we discussed last time, and you sent me a write up on an interesting gentleman named Gleb Boki, who was a Cheka officer and an occultist.
Yeah, both those things at the same time.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And it wasn't this in the 1920s. It wasn't such a strange thing. For instance, you had Nicholas Roerich, who was this weird theosophist, neo-mystical painter guy, maybe a spy also, who had, they allowed him to do an expedition across Soviet Union, and then he did another one across Central Asia and so on. How prominent was this sort of thing, occultism, in the 1920s Soviet Union, do you think?
Well, it's always popular. It never goes out of style. It's more obvious than others. Well, officially the Soviet state is atheist, and therefore since occultism is, you could say, a variety of religious experience, let's put it this way, it's always focused upon much the same things that you would find in mainstream religions, which is the belief in super powerful mystical beings. Right? All of them have that. Whether you want to call them gods, angels, devils, whatever it is, there's always a belief in some sort of a mystical,
transcendent
world of power. I guess a wider spiritual reality. And officially, Bolshevism wanted none of that. Okay, it was purely materialistic. They would tolerate it to one degree. And so I think officially occultism was no more than tolerated. But because it wasn't something like it's not a church, or because it's not an organized religion, because it doesn't present any kind of social structure in some way. It tends to be relatively small groups of people quietly and often unobtrusively associating with each other and studying and practicing these different ideas. It doesn't present any kind of real social force. And it's also generally very attractive to people who often have some kind of prior religious or spiritual background who've become disillusioned with that. I mean, people who tend to go into metaphysics are almost always looking for something that they lost elsewhere. This is always going to be the return. I often encounter people who go in for what could be called popular mysticism, who would claim that they're not religious at all, and don't view this, that this is some kind of purer, more organic set of belief, that no, it's not a matter of religion, which they associate with some sort of formal church or some kind of structure. It allows them to do things pretty much on their own. But yes, they've just gravitated from one religion to another. They've found some new answer or some new set of procedures that they can go through to make their life make more sense, if nothing else. But it's a low key. Occultists, they don't have big parades. They don't have festivals. They tend not to have holidays. You wouldn't really notice that their existence. So it's one of those things that even in an anti-religious totalitarian political structure can pretty easily sort of move between the cracks. It's one of those things that's not that noticeable.
There's something that I've always wondered, which is that the Soviet Union paid, I don't know if I can say paid lip service, was heavily influenced and it's thought by Hegel, right? Dialecticism and so on.
The
But
whole dialectic thing, yeah.
when I read Hegel, it seems like it's like reading works of mysticism, because he makes a bunch of assertions about some sort of transcendent reality which exists outside of history but is driving history, and so on and so forth. And it's very, it's not science at all. He's making assertions that are not really verifiable about transcendent forces driving the course of human events and the actions of men. Um, and I've always wondered how if they even bothered reconciling this. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I don't know. You get into one of my not so favorite topics of philosophy. So,
Sorry. No.
no.
Mysticism.
Well, occult philosophy. It all fits. I mean, philosophy is people who have way too much time on their hands sitting around overthinking things. I've never been terribly impressed with anybody's philosophy. I don't care whether it's Hegel's or whether it's Kierkegaard's or whoever it is this effort to try to come up with some sort of overarching explanation for everything and trying to figure out how things work. And not to say that there aren't useful speculations that occur, that they don't think about some interesting things, or, Nietzsche, all right, I fail to figure out why anybody pays attention to him. And it's interesting in some way, but to me, he's just rambling from one thing to another. It doesn't make any particular amount of coherent sense. But they ask the questions that people, other people have these questions and we want answers for them. But I guess it all comes down to what's the meaning of life? How are things supposed to fit together? How does this make sense in some way? They're always trying to make sense of it. And I don't really think that you can. I'm not sure that there's any. Well, I can only speak from personal experience, and that's probably more or less worthless, but I say that I've never encountered any philosophy which to me adequately explains existence or is even particularly useful to it.
I guess my question is just that you had this country or empire that claimed to worship rationality above all things and scientific materialism. But at the heart of it is something that's not really scientific and not really materialistic at all. And that's something more akin to occultism. At least, that's the impression I got from it. I'm not really worried about the merits of Hegel as a philosopher. I was just kind of interested how the Soviet elites, whether the fact that it's a bunch of mind-numbing gibberish is what brought value to it, or whether they had some sort of worldview where this, they saw some sort of deeper sense in it, or what. You know what I mean?
Well, if you looked at the Soviet elite, especially if you go back and look at the people who would be attracted to the revolutionary movements that would create that elite, it wasn't universally, but it was largely composed of relatively educated people in a country where most people were not well educated. So it was comparatively rare. That gave them a sense of enlightenment, as opposed and compared to peasants, they were enlightened as they saw it. Not that they had a lot of the practical skills that peasants had. Peasants were very good at being peasants. They had all of the skills that were useful to survive for centuries in the position that they were in. Put city people in that position and they die. They didn't have those type of skills. On the other hand, literacy wasn't common among the peasantry because it wasn't particularly useful to them. You don't have to read and write in order to raise crops. It's one of the things that's handy, but it's not necessary. So almost all revolutionaries tended to think of themselves as intellectuals in one form or another. Most of them had some rough exposure to universities, whether they ever graduated, they attended them for some time. They thought that they were smarter than everyone else. They were probably more educated and more aware. And so the idea of a political and social system based purely upon rationality appealed to people who saw themselves, because they were at least halfway educated, as being examples of rational human beings. But maybe it comes back to the essential point is that how rational people are to begin with, as to how rational human beings are by nature, because we become irrational very, very quickly. It's never, I think it's always a very thin veneer of rational behavior over human beings, because most of the time we don't necessarily, I don't think it comes naturally to us in some respects. But yeah, people who thought that they were smarter than everybody else in the country had basically gotten control of a system, and we're just going to organize it, and we'll put engineers of humanity in control of everything, and everything will work out. That's all we have to do. It's just a matter of perfecting the process that we would need to have.
There's kind of a parallel here to the modern U.S. as well. You have all these people who went to college, whether they learned anything there or not, is secondary. Usually, learning things was beside the point, and now they're college educated. They have political ideas. They're not practical about anything. They don't know how to do anything anymore because, again, deindustrialization. But they are maybe fertile ground for ideas that sort of sound good, and work out poorly in the big picture, like the Soviet Union. Maybe there was something I wanted to ask. It seems like the 1920s were freewheeling, and I always thought that Stalin cracked down on things, so you wouldn't have people like Boki anymore, right? Or at least they were very deep underground. You never hear anything from them. And I read something very interesting. There was a guy named Frol Kozlov, who was a Politburo official, and he became Khrushchev's number two. He, with Khrushchev's downfall, he disappeared. But he visited the U.S. in 1959, and one of the places they took this guy was Bohemian Grove, which I thought was very, very strange because, you have this high-ranking Soviet guy, you would think you'd take him around to like the factories and the cornfields and, go, wow, this is our awesome soybean production technology. How do you like that? You caught me. And maybe they did all that, but they were also like, hey, come check this thing out.
So they took him there as a guest.
Yes.
Did he give a talk? Was he invited to give a talk?
I don't know. I'm trying to imagine what he said when he came back to the Politburo. I mean, I think the Alex Jones version would be something like, wow, they're just like us. And my cynical version is he would say something like what Nixon said. You know what Nixon said about Bohemian Grove?
Yes, he said it was the most goddamn faggiest thing he'd ever seen, or something to that effect.
Yes.
And I'm quoting him. I'm not saying that.
Yeah. No, I don't know. I've never been to Bohemian Grove.
But Nixon also credited, Nixon was invited to go there and give what's called a lakeside, give one of the key addresses at the summer camp that they're having. So, and he later acknowledged, and he was probably right, that he was being auditioned for the Republican nomination for president because he'd lost. So he was trying to retool himself as the new Nixon, which worked for a while. And he was giving this talk, and it was an interview basically, because here sitting around listening to this talk were the guys who were going to fund his campaign if he was going to try to get the nomination. And he thought that this was, that somehow he passed the audition and this secured his return to American politics and his election to president in short order. And yet at the same time, he pretty much despised everything he was looking at. So he never was, he thought this was a complete sort of game these guys were playing, which it is. And, Bohemian Grove, we might have talked about this before, is a lot of people tend to think that that's the organization, that there's some thing called Bohemian Grove. And it's not. The organization is the Bohemian Club, which is actually centered in San Francisco. That's where their office is. And Bohemian Grove is this forest preserve, this 2,700 acres of redwoods to the north of San Francisco, where they have their playground. This is where they built what is a summer camp for rich guys, and it has the different kind of cabins. Each one kind of has a particular name and a theme to it, and everyone is assigned to this. And you do things like you put on skits and musical performances, and you participate in the mock pagan rituals and all of these things. But it's
really see where Nixon was coming from.
Yeah, it's a summer camp for rich men, and there's always a certain number of guests who are brought in. So, what a Soviet would have thought of that would have been interesting in some ways in terms of what was going on.
Well, it's funny because his name, Frolkoslov, is like the most peasant sounding name in the history of Russian peasant sound names. I guess for the non-Russian speakers in the audience, it's about the equivalent of Skeeter, or Jimmy Bob or something like that. So this dude, I'm assuming, came from peasant beginnings and then climbed his way all the way up to the Politburo, and he goes to America and he gets taken to this thing. And when he comes back, he's made Khrushchev's number 2. So I thought it was just a very, very strange, anomalous fact.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I'd never heard that. That would have been, some people, again, Alex Jones could spin it that, the Bohemian Club is all some wholly owned subsidiary of the Illuminati. And they're simply dictating who gets that. That's why he becomes Khrushchev's number 2, is because the Illuminati, the Bohemian Grove, made him that. This is their command center, and they're appointing all of these people, which is, bullshit. Okay, that's. I think they were probably trying to impress him in some way. This is like the greatest. We'll show them what capitalism can achieve, and how we're going to go out and waste our money in the woods dressing up in costumes. That will be it. He'll be completely blown away by this.
There's no need to nuke us. No. Look what we've done to ourselves.
Right.
I just the more I think about it, the more of a hilarious scene it is. This guy in his badly fitted Soviet suit just kind of scratching his head. The cremation of care or whatever, just kind of going, I don't know what these capitalists are doing, dude. We need more.
Well, it's one of those questions, that often comes up. I mean, why all the play acting that goes on? Is this just a way of having? Why the robes? There we go. Why is that necessary in order to go out into the woods and have fun? So if the cremation of care ritual is the thing that opens the whole sort of 2-week encampment. Look, you've got an artificial lake. You've got this 40-foot mock stone talking owl. And this is what you all gather in your robes with musical accompaniment. And then you perform what is a mock human sacrifice of what is supposed to be dull care. So what you're actually burning at the foot of the owl is supposed to represent all of because this is a getaway, supposedly, for men who are involved in business, finance, men who supposedly have great responsibilities and heavy crowns weighing down on their head. And this is their place to go and cut loose and get away from all of those things. So our first ritual we're going to enact is the ritual burning of care, of all of our worries. And
get away from it all.
Yeah, and we're just going to get away from it all.
Until Nixon comes and makes a speech, which is his addition.
Because we're never supposed to talk about anything serious, except we do talk about things serious, because there's no way you're going to get all these guys together in the woods and not have them talk about things that are, whether that's what they're supposed to be doing or not, they'll do that anyway, because there's just not enough hijinks. Okay. All of the stuff they do there are called hijinks. The little skits and tricks and things they put on. There's not enough of that to keep them busy all of the time. But you have this very elaborate ritual reenactment. And so one of the questions that to me hovers over that whole thing is this just theatrics? Is it just amateur theatrics? Are you just doing this because it's somehow fun to dress up in costumes and reenact a human sacrifice in full of a giant stone owl that you have to have? Or is there something more serious to this? I mean, are you actually, some of you at least, maybe not everyone who was there, is this, I mean, a ritual is a ritual is a ritual. It's the same thing. The only thing that matters is what intention and what seriousness the people who engage in take it. So for someone participating in that, standing there in their robes, this could be nothing more than kind of silly fun and games. It's just a kind of stunt. It's a skit which is being put on, a very elaborate skit. But for someone else, this could have a much deeper meaning. And the sheer elaborateness of it, which is put into it, the amount of money and trouble and time which is put into it, would suggest to me that somewhere along the line, among the people who designed and instituted this ritual, they took it seriously. I mean, you would have to take it seriously to put that much effort into it.
Well, I mean, there's town pageants in Midwestern America that people prepare for all year, but they don't have a deep mystical significance.
Well,
on the other hand,
not obviously, not to the outsider, but
right.
It doesn't necessarily mean the people on the inside may not.
Maybe. And then, every party, there's an after party. You might or might not get invited to. So there's something very interesting that happened in the USSR in the 1980s, and I remember this because I was a little kid. You were talking about being a kid in the late 50s, so I was a kid in the late 80s, and we were living in America at the time. But I still speak Russian, and I had relatives in the USSR in the 80s and 90s, and there was something that happened that was like a worldview collapse, because until then, the discourse, was more or less based around general facts. I mean, maybe the specific facts were bullshit, but the context was more or less reliable, meaning that the newspapers or the news would say, we got a tremendous victory and, like brotherly Yemen or whatever. And you go, okay, there's a country named Yemen. There are Russian forces in there, or at least we're sponsoring them. There's some kind of war going on. Maybe we won, maybe we lost, but whatever. And then at a certain point, you could just print or say on the news or on TV anything you wanted to. Right? Like all the censorship was gone, and you could, make any claim you wanted to. It didn't matter. And I saw people that had spent their lives as rational human beings all of a sudden believe. There was a guy named Kashpirovsky who would use his telepathic powers to heal people through their television, kind of like you had in America with faith healers, I guess in the 60s or whatever, that would do the same thing. But this guy was doing it through, I don't know, objective scientific phenomena. And these people would believe in this stuff because it was on TV, they wouldn't let him lie like completely, right? There's got to be something to it. And then eventually it turned out that no, it's all complete bullshit. You can say anything you want. And people had this kind of worldview collapse. And we saw something like this in America over the last maybe 15 years, something like that. I don't know, like where now you have people discussing flat Earth, and you have QAnon, and you have theories about the elites harvesting adrenochrome from infants whom they sacrifice. And you have people who say, like the COVID vaccine is a plan to wipe out all of humanity. And you have people who say, no, it's save all humanity. What's actually going to wipe everybody out? And you can say anything. People go on TV and talk about manifesting things, which is to say that if you want a pony enough, the universe is going to drop you a pony in your front, and there's this kind of worldview collapse where you can claim anything, and a significant part of the population will go, yeah, yeah, sure, that makes sense, right? It doesn't have to be connected to any kind of fact, maybe very tangentially.
Well, part of that it's directly connected to the internet. There we go. The rise of the internet, which was supposed to connect everybody, and it does. It does connect people, and it provides access to information that people didn't have previously. But it's. I think part of it is that what happens when you make all of this information available to people who in many cases have no real idea what to do with it. I mean, first of all, the sheer mass of it becomes overwhelming. So people will pick and choose the things that they're interested in. The other thing you find on the internet, I probably spend way too much time looking at YouTube videos. But part of it is that there's this, you can just go from one subject to another. And a lot of stuff there's stuff that's well done and it's informative, and I learn things that I didn't know before. But that's sort of embedded in this much larger matrix of stuff, which is just, either narcissistically self-indulgent, which is what much of it is, or people simply going on about things that they really know nothing about. It simply, there's no filter in the type of information that comes out of it. And I could give I give an example that. So I live in a relatively small town in a western state in Idaho called Moscow. Okay, interestingly enough. And things here are generally pretty quiet. This is the usual sort of localized crime, not too much. People tend not to lock their doors. Shouldn't tell too many people that, but that's not that common. There's a killing every now and then. Every now and then something happens, somebody kills somebody else, but those are fairly rare occurrences. But a few years ago, there was something that sort of momentarily gained national news so it's a university town. The whole town is here because the University of Idaho is here. And 4 students who lived together in one house were very brutally murdered one evening. So you had 3 young women and 1 guy were basically killed. They were knifed to death in their house. This was quite shocking. I could never remember anything like that happening. Subsequently, there's a guy who was arrested for it. He is still awaiting trial, which will eventually take place maybe this summer, and we can finally figure out what happened. But that event, a grisly murder, has spawned this whole kind of its own internet subculture in which so-called citizen sleuths, people who've watched too many TV shows, who've immersed themselves in series of like CSI and now think that they know about criminal deduction and legal procedures, which they generally don't, set themselves up to go through and analyze this case. And that has, one of the things that has sort of perversely attracted my attention is the degree to which people have glommed onto this case and just gone on to spin out the most absurd misinformation or disinformation about it, of just sort of letting their fantasies run wild and trying to reconstruct the case, different aspects of it, and usually talking about the town, the university, which all have their faults to a degree, but completely portraying things out of any sense of reality. They're constantly they're talking about the town, the community, the place, the people that live there, and creating this whole picture that bears no resemblance to the actual place they're talking about. They're just fantasizing these things and coming up with these narratives on their own that have no grounding in reality, or even in many ways in common sense. But what I'm astounded by is the following they get on this and the constant approval feedback that they get. I can look at these people who've got, for some reason it's not a lot. They've got 13,000 subscribers and 30,000 people just watched their video in which they just spewed idiocy, in which they said nothing that has any kind of bearing on reality or is useful to the case in any way. And you multiply that by the hundreds and thousands of other cases. I'm just talking about one, notorious criminal case in one town and the kind of subculture of lies and fantasy which has been created around that, and then it extends elsewhere. And it's the concept in some cases that if you give everyone a forum, one of the things the internet has technically done, something like YouTube and all, TikTok, the rest of them, which I thankfully pay no particular attention to, but they're out there. It's given everyone this kind of soapbox. Anyone who wants can get on and can essentially perform or present themselves in some way or simply engage in whatever sort of narcissistic display that they want. And that's what it's largely become. I mean, the sort of signal to noise ratio, the actually getting kind of useful, thoughtful, structured information has become a smaller and smaller proportion of this huge sort of carnival which goes on. And I think it comes to the idea, if we give everybody a soapbox, then everybody will have a voice. Well, the point is that most people don't have much of anything to say.
But I wonder, I mean, you saw the same thing happen in the late Soviet Union. There was no internet, there was no YouTube, there was no TikTok, nothing. And I'm not even talking about, people spouting gibberish, but the general public sort of losing its context and its worldview, where who the hell knows what might be true? Anything might be true. Anything might be a lie. You can trust nothing. And I wonder, if this is something that happened during the later days of, let's say, the Roman Empire or other large cultures and states, where until then there was a general shared context, and then eventually, you had people kind of lose faith in that. Maybe a manifestation of that is that people go down these rabbit holes that may be true and, maybe completely false, and maybe anything in between. But the general kind of collapse of the context is what I'm talking about.
Well, I'm not trying to, I think what the internet has done, what the YouTubeization of culture, at least in the US, has done, has accelerated that process. But it's a way of sort of exponentially increasing it, and just increasing the amount of chaotic information which is coming out of it. But another kind of example of this is you get into these people who have the whole Tartaria thing. Does that come up in Israel at all? Well, this just seems what it comes down to. People began looking at old maps, and very often, if you looked at old maps, I'm talking about 15th, 16th century, there would often be a large area of Eastern Asia, sort of Siberia, that area, which often would be labeled Tartaria. Mostly because European map makers really wasn't sure what was there, and ultimately there really wasn't a lot there, and that's where the Tatars had come from or something. So it was Tartaria or Tartary, which then gets connected to this word Tartarus, which meant
Hades.
Hell, some sort of Hades-like area. Yeah. Those two things gradually because they sounded alike, they got combined. Well, that not too long ago created this whole idea, this kind of meme, that there was some ancient suppressed civilization. So the reason why this name Tartaria is on all of these maps, because at one point there had been some sort of huge global empire. There had been some sort of super state of Tartaria, and it had some kind of marvelous civilization, which has now been, through some kind of historical conspiracy, has been edited out of all the books. So the reason that we don't read about it in history books isn't because it never existed in the first place, but because it has been It has been hidden from us. And then they go around looking at if you look at buildings in the past, if you look at a lot of modern architecture, if you look at all of our Bauhaus distended stuff, it is pretty boring stuff. I'll sort of admit. Okay. It's the utilitarianization of architecture. Or if you go back to something, it's like Art Deco, but if you go back into the night, buildings, especially public buildings, were always adorned. They were elaborate. There was a much more striking type of architecture. And it's like people now go back and they look at old pictures of older buildings and they see the kind of cityscapes that, at least, let's say, you'd have in some place like Paris or even New York in the late 19th century. And they look at this and they've never seen, this seems to be a completely new form of architecture to them. And they believe that this must be monuments of this kind of ancient civilization, which has somehow been edited out. That these are all monuments to some kind of ancient civilization. We don't know. No, it's just different style of architecture. That's all it was. And I was talking to a person about this, and I was trying to get across to him that, no, what you're looking at, that's Art Deco. It's a particular style. It's early 20th century. It is not the artifact of some sort of ancient suppressed civilization. It's just a style that came in and then went out of style. And it's pretty cool. And maybe it ought to come back, but there's nothing else any more to it than that.
This is a symptom of collapse, no? The fact that people look at things that were created several hundred years ago using manual labor and rudimentary tools, more or less rudimentary tools, and see them as the works of some giant, mystery race, kind of like the Greeks would look at the pyramids and go, wow, back then there were giants, it was the golden age. But this seems like a kind of an indictment. This seems like evidence of some sort of civilizational collapse almost, where you look at, I was looking at pictures of Central Asian architecture a few days ago, things you see in modern day Uzbekistan. And they're massive, they're monumental. I've seen some of the lost cities in Afghanistan's desert of death myself, and they're, monumental, tremendous. I understand how these things were made, more or less, but I can also understand that to somebody who lives in a deindustrialized society that's never made anything themselves or never seen people make things themselves and don't understand how things are made, because this is a skill set that's been atrophied as a result of policy or class warfare or whatever you want to call it, or just the natural development of historical processes. And then they look at something like this and they go, they can create an entire myth out of it, right?
Well, I think the early form of this was all of the speculation, which goes back decades, about the pyramids. So, ever since Westerners, we thought that they were smarter than everybody else, discovered the pyramids, their whole idea was they just couldn't figure out how these things could be built. And, it does take some imagination to look into that, but clearly these are structures that somebody built them, they were constructed, and I don't have any problem believing they were constructed by human beings who found the means to do that. One of the things about we humans is that whatever else our limitations, generally if there's a problem, we'll find some way to do it. So if we want to create an artificial mountain, which is what a pyramid is, we'll find a way to do that. And what often I think modern people can't quite fathom is the amount of labor intensity that would be involved in that. The sheer number of people that you would have to have and the amount of time and physical labor. Particularly in a population which isn't used to that, which has I think, a very limited ability to sort of grasp the idea of physical labor, that could even be done. And so then that spun the ideas that, well, since humans obviously couldn't build this, or I couldn't imagine myself building it, then it must have been, what's the answer to this? Aliens.
Aliens.
There we go. The aliens did it. They levitated the stones. That's the explanation. That's the only way that you could get them into place. No, there was some other way. It was a lot of work, but it accomplished its goal.
The pyramids specifically, there's stuff that I was reading by a guy who was a machinist. He wrote this in the, I think, 80s, where he did measurements on the sarcophagi inside, which are made of granite. And, he was saying that the surface smoothness is down to thousandths of an inch or tens of thousandths of an inch. And there's no amount of manual labor that I know of that you can do that to granite using copper tools. I mean, you can maybe, you can grind, for instance, if you're making a lathe, you have to make ways that the lathe travels on, right? You need that to be smooth. And you can manually, scrape it, with aluminum. If you have steel tools, you can scrape it down, and it's a very tedious, laborious process. But, to do this for granite, but I think most modern people looking at this stuff don't have even like that background to go, okay, you'd have to have some sort of machine that itself was precise enough to make, for them, everything is, it could be anything, could be aliens. It could be whatever.
I'm not going to sit here and say it couldn't be alien. Maybe.
No, I mean, to them, like there's no like left and right boundaries. Anything could be, because the whole world basically functions on magic, and there's no such thing as like reality anymore to them, because their context is gone away, in a sense, right? Like those Russian people that, again, in the 90s were, they were all of a sudden they were victims of these rudimentary marketing campaigns that, you could cure cancer with like aged bat poop called, what's it called? It's called mumia, right? Which is like bat guano. You have bat caves where bats have been living for 100,000 years. And so the entire floor is like a 3-meter deep deposit of bat crap. And so people would appear on TV and start marketing this stuff to these Russians, these Soviet people who were completely mentally unequipped for this reality. And they were buying this stuff because their whole like epistemological context was just, it was just blown up. It just collapsed. You know what I mean?
Yes. I mean, you can see that. You could probably sell that here. I'm pretty sure you could.
Oh, for sure.
I haven't seen bat crap for sale, but it's it's similar to the way in how people get recruited into what are called cults, and I remember my first real sort of exposure to that was, I was in grad school at the time, and I lived in the glossy seaside town of Santa Barbara, California, which has its own kind of unreality attached to it. But there was some guy, there was a guy who had this whole sort of history. Well, there was a guy named Norm Paulson. That's what his name was. And he had worked his way through various forms of occult or mystical belief. Theosophy was a portion of that. Then he became interested in yoga. That's pretty, seemingly the low end of the speed spectrum of mysticism, but there's a bit of that. And then he basically just cobbled together bits and pieces of things. And this had everything from bits and pieces of theosophy, thing about, I'm sure aliens were involved, Lemurians, the survivals of some sunken, non-existent continent in the Pacific. And he came up with this recipe of ideas of sort of self-help spiritualism, and essentially began selling it, and first to a small group of people and then to a larger group of people, and formed a thing called the Brotherhood of the Sun. And that was, or the sun, and then that became sort of Sunburst Industries or Sunburst Farms. And it started eventually started businesses. There was like a natural foods market, which was pretty good, actually. Some restaurants. They bought, land out in the country to raise the organic food they were going to sell in their markets. That all sounds harmless enough, but then what else inevitably comes along with this? All right, it inevitably, you got these people who are following everything that their leader says. He is the center of the universe, and everything he says is true, and they do what he says. And so, out on the farm, you also, and always lurking in the background of this is the idea that there's going to be an apocalypse. Okay, the world is going to end and collapse, so we must begin hoarding guns and ammunition and building bunkers at the farm. So now you've got people living out in the country, growing organic food to sell in their market in town, who are also preparing for the apocalypse by hoarding guns and ammunition, waiting for the world to end. But I knew some people who were, and again, these are university educated people. I couldn't tell you what they had degrees in, but they all had degrees in something. So you can't blame it on the fact that they're uneducated. They're not just ignorant in that particular way. They think that they're smart, which is why they'll go for this. And one evening, they were just sitting around telling me about all the wonders of the brotherhood that they'd become a part of and how it had changed. And it seemed to make them happy. But this involved also handing over all of their, handing over all of their assets to the group. Getting rid of all those pesky material possessions that were harming, stunting your existence, and therefore you would get rid of that. It all goes back to the idea of donating things to the church, because somehow in the church's hands it's okay, but you'll just give it away to them. So they gave away all of their stuff to this guy. And I remember listening to this, and the only thing I could think of basically to say was like, what the hell's the matter with you? I mean, have you lost your minds? Because that's what it sounded like to me. I'm not saying that I'm right about it, but my response to that was that no, none of this sounds particularly interesting. It sounds like you've lost your mind, that you've, the term, whatever term, taken leave of your senses, lost any kind of sense of rationality, and that now you've put your life, your welfare, the welfare of your children, everything else in the hands of this guy who's just telling you this story, which doesn't even seem to make much sense. Yet, it seemed to work for them.
Interesting. What happened in the long term?
I don't know what happened to them in the long term. I think they got a divorce. Okay, it was a couple. But I think one of them pretty much stayed with it. The group over time, it was prosperous for a while. Then in the time that I was still living there, some journalists began to look into it, and that's where the things like the various forms of abuse began to appear. I think in some cases people were being held prisoner. One of the things about cults is that it's sometimes complicated to leave. Getting out becomes a kind of problem. And the whole little empire eventually collapsed. I think there's still a remnant of it around somewhere. They eventually moved out of California to another state, and then they moved somewhere else. Paulson died, which was not quite the end of it, but it still hangs on in some form. And these groups generally have there's usually a slow beginning. It's like any other sort of entity, or the general growth cycle. It starts small, it grows, reaches a kind of peak, and then there's a decline and collapse, just like with civilizations.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. You have that S cycle. I had a guy on the podcast named Malcolm Collins, he calls himself a pro-natalist. Him and his wife, I guess they're prominent in the pro-natalist community, and I think the idea of pronatalism is that people should have a bunch of kids. And he made some very valid points, one of which is that birth rates are greater everywhere, except for maybe sub-Saharan African countries with, average IQs of 60 or whatever. But everywhere, what used to be the first world, the second world, most of the third world birth rates are cratering, way below replacement, and there doesn't seem to be um, the process doesn't seem to be slowing down or reversing. And he pointed out that all of modern institutions are built around the assumption that the next generation is going to be as big as the last one, or at least, well, maybe bigger, at least as big. And that's how you're going to pay for this generation's retirement. That's how you're going to keep things going. That's how you're going to maintain all this, incredible, complicated infrastructure. And that's no longer true. And I was thinking that, you've had civilizations collapse due to birth rate failures. You had the Roman Empire have a population replacement where I think by the second century of the Common Era, people were complaining that, everywhere you go in Rome, it's all full of like freedmen, former slaves, and it's full of guys that came here from Syria and so on and so forth. And where'd all the Romans go? And the answer was that they didn't bother making baby Romans, and so they're replaced with this. But I don't know of any case where this was something that was global. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I suppose was the idea that things can spread. It's an interesting. I think in some ways it's almost inevitable, in a sense that, human population has really taken off. If you look at the historical trend of it, for centuries, for millennia, it was always sort of hovering around 500 million or so. And that was it. It never tended, the Roman period and even well into the 15th century would sort of go above that. Then you'd have the bubonic plague or something that would go along, would bring it back. So I think roughly, I'm doing this from memory, is that by the time you get to about 1800, things sort of begin to take off for unclear reasons. I've never gotten a really satisfying explanation of it. But beginning in the late 17th century and into the 18th century, there's this marked uptick, and you reach 1 billion by about 1800. Then by the time you get to another century, you're about 2 billion. And then the 8 billion that we're now approaching it just goes from there. It just goes along like this and then up all of a sudden. So there's been this extraordinarily rapid rise in human population. So again, if you look at the way things tend to work in the world, if you look at nature elsewhere, any population which tends to grow that way will at some point peak and it will crash. It will collapse, not entirely disappear probably, but it is unsustainable. Things in nature don't work that way. You don't have the population of anything that just goes uncontrollably, continually upward without eventually, what goes up must come down.
But usually that happens as a result of outstripping food supplies or whatever. Humans are different.
Yeah.
What happens here is you have people who, have more food than they need. You have huge obesity rates. They're not freezing. They're not dying of thirst. They're choosing not to have children because it allows them to focus on, let's say, more hedonic pursuits, or they're choosing to have far fewer children than they could have been, every year fewer. And the question is, because we're not really natural beings, right? We're civilized, we're cultured beings. A lot of what we do is not driven by genetics. It's driven by culture. It's not even driven by, like, you see monkeys and elephants and stuff. You have a sort of culture where it's passed down from one generation to the next. Here we have cultural changes that happen in the span of years. So what the parents were doing doesn't look like what the children are doing at all. And the question is, I guess my question is this: when you look at historically what people do that keeps things going, a lot of it they do because they have the expectation, maybe the internalized expectation, that they're doing it for their kids. They're doing it for the next generation. Do you know what I mean? Even if they personally didn't manage to raise kids to adulthood, even if their children died before, having their own children, but there's just a general expectation. What they're going to do when there is no next generation to do it for, why do anything other than just pure hedonism and fear of suffering? You know what I mean? And so instead of thinking of things in terms of decades and in terms of centuries and millennia, when you mentioned architecture, how much more striking previous architecture was than what you have now. And a lot of it, I think, has to do with the fact that the people that were building it were thinking, consciously or subconsciously, somebody's going to come along, my descendants, my people are going to see this in 100 years, in 1,000 years, however long this thing stands. Whereas now, after me, the flood, who cares? I got a couple of decades and then that's it.
Well, there's a sense of, if someone was going to build, whether it was the Parthenon, the pyramids were built to last. The idea that this was a monument that would presumably last forever, or as long as you can imagine. So it was the construction of something like Notre Dame, for instance.
Sorry. Sorry, we're having some kind of audio difficulty.
I think that might have been my chair. It was moving around my chair. Maybe
no. Okay, now it's back. Okay. Yes. Sorry.
Okay. So if you look at something like Notre Dame, it's impressive. It's meant to be impressive. And again, it's not something which is meant to be temporary. The idea is this was something that was going to be constructed for forever, or at least for as long as anyone could possibly exist. A lot of modern buildings they're torn down. The idea is they're not necessarily going to be there very long. They're fairly temporary. Well, we're still being told that, we have to fight climate change for the next generation. Remember, that's what Greta Thunberg is telling us, is that her whole generation is being cheated their future by us, by all the selfish adults emitting too much carbon. And I'm not going to get any further into that, but there's still this idea that one has to preserve the world, one has to think ahead, have some sort of responsibility for future generations. But you're also right in saying that people, in a practical sense, don't seem to have much vision of that. It almost is if many people don't have any particular reason to exist. I mean, why do you exist? What's the point? You're going to if some of the tech bros have the idea that they can cheat mortality by downloading themselves, digitizing themselves, and becoming one with their computers to achieve that kind of immortality. And there are people who, yes, really think that they can do that. Maybe they will. But elsewhere, I think that a lot of people have simply lost any real sense of why they exist in the first place. And that life is really just a series of self-indulgences and things you do until you get bored with it, and then you move on to something else. I mean, the reality is that it's sort of modern life, and let's say certainly from the U.S. standpoint, is that beyond the sheer biological imperative of having children, the other point was that in much of the past, they also had an economic value. First, they were going to be workers in the future, but even as children, again, in an agricultural environment, they were put to work. There was an advantage of having a lot of hands to do things. That was what you did before you had machines to do things. You had lots of people to do them. And so children would play. My mom, for instance, grew up on a farm. And I sort of grew up hearing stories about her on a farm. And From the time she was 5 or 6 years old, she was doing something. It was feeding the chickens, collecting eggs. Everybody had some kind of job to do. But what the modern society has transformed children to is sort of glorified pets. I mean, first of all, they generally can't work. Their education provides them no sort of there's no really nothing for them to do in that regard, and they're expensive. They have a huge amount of money, and there's no return on that. There's no return. There's no monetary return in the investment. So, childbearing doesn't become this kind of biological imperative because you don't see that you need them to sort of continue the whole vitality of the society. You need to have enough people that are going to keep repairing the walls and, rebuilding the wells, whatever it is that needs to be done. Instead, they're just kind of glorified pets you have because you think that that's what you're supposed to do. And they are then tremendously indulged because there are few of them. A great deal of emphasis is placed upon the 1 or 2 children or 2.5 children that people have. And it sounds, I know that it will sound callous and cruel to many people, but in the more natural environment of the past, where women would have many children, more or less continue. And one of the reasons for that is that a fair number of them were going to die. And that was one of the things that you would accept. It was just going to be part of it. I don't think that was ever easy for anybody, but it was one of those things that was accepted. But I think in the past that children were looked upon in very different ways. They were kind of investments. They were a certain degree of labor in some sense because there were many of them. You might have your favorites. Some might get more than others, but it was, you're going to have a bunch of them. You're going to lose some of them, and all of them are going to have some kind of useful purpose. That's a kind of unromanticized way of looking at children, but that's what drives the whole thing. It's not simply creating glorified pets. Nature isn't interested in you creating glorified pets.
We mentioned. Sorry, I'm getting a bunch of feedback here from your side. Maybe the speakers are close to the microphone.
No, I thought I turned. The only speaker I have should be the one in the computer.
Okay,
let me try that.
Let's try. We mentioned Nietzsche early in this conversation, and there were 2 things that he said that I think are maybe germane, which is one of them that he said that God is dead in his generation, which is to say that dead in people's hearts, meaning that educated people in his generation generally didn't see God as either real or really involved in their lives or, really a serious touch point. And then the other one is that at the end of history, you'd have what he called the last men, which are these sort of kind of little bundles of hedonic impulses who don't really want to suffer. They want to have their little moderate enjoyments. Everybody in the past they say was crazy. All these people fighting their wars and doing all this stuff and suffering, and what was it all for? It's all pointless. The main thing is to just kind of hang out in your studio apartment and watch Netflix and just kind of enjoy things. And he called them the last men because obviously after that generation, there would be no further generations. The last men are not going to go have a bunch of kids and raise them and do great heroic things and so on. And it kind of struck me when I read that how similar that is to this. And it struck me also, I thought, but maybe that's not the end of it, because when you look at the late Soviet Union, they didn't have a lot of kids either. They aborted most of the children they conceived for more or less the exact same reasons. We can't put these kids to work. We can't get any use out of them. They cost a bunch of money, which we don't have too much of anyway. And why not just abort them? And so you had this kind of incredibly hedonic population in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, this very like cynical, materialistic, hedonic um, generation. And then, but it didn't just collapse, because in the 90s they had a massive, massive, massive crime wave where you had, before we started recording, we were talking about the Cossacks and how Babel sort of saw them as these sort of superhuman or subhuman or some kind of combination of two, like kind of savages. And this is basically the Russia of the 90s. Anybody that had the courage and the daring would basically become a professional criminal or some sort of criminalized businessman and engage in sort of a war of all against all, right? And I'm thinking, because these guys grew up in this kind of collapse of a worldview and collapse of a context, and if nothing really exists beyond yourself and your desires, then why not? If you can get away with savagery, like, why not? If you can come out on top of it. And I'm wondering if this is something that we can expect to see in the West in the near future as well.
Well, you certainly have a lot of people who think that the meaning of life is playing video games, indulging yourself in a virtual reality, to the exclusion of the real one. Because one of the things you get to do in the virtual games is that if you die, you just get to respawn, and you gradually you can do things over and over and over again. Whereas real life can often seem to be a series of frustrating, continual disappointments in some way, because you don't get what you want. Maybe there's more going on here than you talked about that generally, if you have the case of any kind of species whose population tends to go into overdrive, that it will exhaust its food supplies. That's usually the main way in which the population will be restored to some kind of equilibrium. Simply eat everything up, and then the population will collapse because most of them will starve. And humans have gotten around that by being able, certainly for the past couple of centuries, to greatly increase food supply. But there's going to be a limit to that. But maybe there's more. Gotta give, nature is a mysterious thing. I don't know. Maybe to be a heretic, I might say that nature is the closest. Maybe it's God. Or maybe it's some manifestation of it. Maybe it's not this kind of completely mechanical process, but that one of the things that nature could in some way, or some force within nature can control, is that if this species is getting out of control and it can't be limited in the usual way, then its mind, its perceptions can be affected. Or maybe just one of the things that comes out of that as, in a way, I guess what I'm trying to say, is that human life has become easier. And by becoming easier, that's one of the things that has clearly led to the proliferation of humans, by the fact that their mere existence has become easier. The sheer ease of that then gradually decreases the very value of the life that you have. We tend to think of, we all want an easy life. That's what we want, right? We want plenty of food, sex whenever we want it. Everything will be pleasant, a warm place, comfortable shoes and a warm place to go to the bathroom. That's what we want to have.
Nixon. Is that Nixon? No, that's sorry. That's LBJ.
Spiro Agnew, I think. Yeah.
Agnew, one of those guys.
So, but then once you get all of that, once you have this sort of comfortable existence, it becomes boring after a while. There's no kind of, I mean, I think that's what you have people who tend to go in for extreme sports. Okay, I'm going to go. Yeah, I'm going to go.
Rick, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I'm going to take up, not me personally, but people argue that I'm going to take up
base jumping,
base jumping, scuba diving, free climbing. Okay, which is just a death wish in action. Okay, I'm going to go climb rock faces until eventually I fall. But the whole idea of bringing some sort of some sort of element of risk to it, that's what tends to make it most interesting. That's you derive, for some people, derive their real enjoyment in life by constantly playing with death.
But even those people don't have kids. Base jumpers don't have six. You know who has kids? Orthodox Jews. The more Orthodox, the more kids, and the Amish. And not because they have harder lives than everybody else. They have the same. Even the Amish use modern technology. They go to the hospital when they get sick. They use, there's a whole Amish furniture industry. They're using CNCs, right? But they have a different relationship with their worldview. They inhabit a reality that's inherently meaningful.
It's usually there are other religious groups. Mormons generally have a lot of kids.
Not anymore. Mormon birth rates have collapsed.
I don't think as much as they used to. No,
they've collapsed. I was in the army with a bunch of Mormons, and it was normal for them to have 5, 6 kids, and not anymore. Not anymore.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it has decreased. I'm not sure the church advertises that. There is locally, again, where I live, there's a very prominent church in town. In fact, the town in some ways is divided between people who either belong to that church or who are in some way favorable to it, and those who feel that its sheer appearance is a sign of the apocalypse, even though they don't believe in the apocalypse. Who hate the church because of everything that it stands for. And what the church stands for, and I'm not praising it or condemning it, is it stands for very conservative social values, relatively traditional gender roles, and lots of children. And so one of the things that's happened is that the other thing that they don't have much confidence in is that they don't tend to like public schools, and so they have their own private religious schools.
That's wise of them.
One of the things that's happened here is that just recently, one of our elementary schools closed, partly because there just weren't enough students going to, first of all, the general population is having fewer children, and you don't really need that school anymore. And the Christian families, which is what they are all now sending their children to their own schools. They're sort of creating this separate parallel society. The other thing they do is they form lots of businesses, so more and more businesses are associated with the church. And then inevitably you have the argument is that, well, they're taking over the town. Okay, yeah, but I mean, they're starting the businesses that no one else is starting, and they're having the children.
That no one else has.
What do you think is going to happen after a period of time? The future eventually belongs to those who reproduce. And if you don't, well, then you're turning it over to those who do. So don't complain.
Very interesting. So it's my thoughts are that, animals compete on, I have a longer neck so I can eat those leaves up there, and I have access to that resource because of my longer neck or whatever. Humans are competing on ideals. Your evolutionary fitness now is directly controlled by your worldview more than anything else. Isn't that interesting?
I would think so. We are creatures who live in our minds.
Yeah.
As opposed to much less of really living in the real world anymore. Now, I don't claim that I spend a lot of time in it, but it's again, if you look at nature, what we nature's always, it's going to be some sort of show. It's like this thing that you go to the zoo to look at. You're going to go look. I mean, nature's just the way things work. It's the way that everything is. And it's it's fairly brutal. Well, it's not fairly brutal. It's totally brutal. There's nothing of everything is a matter of survival. It's geared towards that alone. That's the only clear, obvious reason you can come up with why any sort of living creature exists is to make more of its own kind. So that seems to be the kind of prime directive which is there, and it's almost as in some way that well, somebody once said is that if you're going to create artificial life, AI, which we think that we're doing now, if you're going to create an actual artificial intelligence, that the true test of that would be whether or not that artificial intelligence could disobey its programming. But the proof that it would be an autonomous intelligence, it would be something other than just something that could do what it was told, was that it would have to be able to deny its programming. And in some way, I could say that when human beings deny their natural self, when they essentially put reproduction on the back shelf or ignore it entirely, they're denying their programming. They are denying the one fundamental thing that actually defines why they exist in the first place. Sure. It's a kind of willful extinction.
Free will presupposes, right, the ability to choose evil, to choose wrong, to choose death. Yeah, I think we're seeing kind of a funnel, a bottleneck of people that are making that choice freely, en masse. Okay, well, we're getting short on time. This has not been a very a chipper conversation.
No, it has delved into some kind of dark places. But think of it this way: not everybody makes those choices.
No.
I think
we can see that there's something, right now.
There's something kind of weird going on there. That this is not a sustainable mindset, and that if you hold that mindset, you will just go extinct, and those who don't will then inherit the earth. So, human beings are pretty resilient. Whatever population collapse comes along, there will be some out there that will still survive, and then it'll just all start over again, I guess.
God willing, I hope we'll have learned something.
We just keep trying.
Right on. Okay. Well, Rick, thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you.